Hi everyone, welcome to our next talk. At the Gender and Diversity Research Cluster. I'm Chong Ming, and together with Lilith, we co-convened the cluster, and we've had a series of speakers talk to us about various aspects of diversity and diverse identities in Singapore. So today we're very pleased to welcome Ms. Rahim, who has been serving as an editor of Beyond the Hijab. That's an online platform sharing personal stories and perspectives of Singaporean Muslim women, and they've been doing this since 2017. Beyond the Hijab aims to give Singaporean Muslim women a non-judgemental space to speak out about issues that affect them in their own voice. Diana's personal interests in her writing and work includes feminism and its interaction with class, race, and religion, as well as the politics of public space. In her spare time, she enjoys reading novels and learning to paint. So today she's going to talk to us about the work that Beyond the Hijab is doing, the difficulties that she's facing along the ways, and how we can think about potential ways of working around them, and we can have a discussion after that. So she's gonna speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and we're gonna have a 40 to 45 minutes Q&A after that. But we have a break in between. Okay, so Diana, ready? We're ready when you are.
Hi, I'm Diana, and so I'm the editor of Beyond the Hijab, and I'm here to talk a little bit more about Beyond the Hijab and what I've learned in my years with the group. I think it's been about 4 or 5 years now, and building community. So when I was to pick a title for the talk, this phrase kind of jumped at me immediately, because like initially when I met with Chong Ming and Lilith, and then we kind of agreed, we can talk about the complexities of trying to speak about the issue of Malay Muslim women, well, not just Malay, but Muslim women in general in Singapore, and the complexities of that, the language you have to adopt, the language that you're resisting against. And I thought a lot about what the purpose of Beyond the Hijab is, what I felt when I first joined the team, and what I wanted to achieve. And so the language that frees us was what came up. So let me see. Okay, so the purpose of Beyond the Hijab, very quickly, is just, it was very easily just to share voices and perspectives of Singaporean Muslim women in a non-judgmental space. And not just non-judgmental, but also non-institutional, because in Singapore, as I'll kind of elaborate later, a lot of, when you want to talk about issues pertaining to minority communities, especially when it comes to race and religion, a lot of it happens in very institutional spaces and limits. So we wanted to be kind of like a space where you can just speak, regardless of what you've been told by your community, your parents, the state, and just kind of like share what you really feel. And so some of the topics we've covered have been mental health, sexuality, intimate partner violence, racism, and to come will be income inequality. And maybe very quickly, I'll describe like the reason for the name. So the name Beyond the Hijab was actually because when it comes to issues relating to Muslim women in Singapore, it's always about the hijab. Like that's the kind of like the limit that people think about, like, oh, the only thing affecting Muslim women is like the right to wear the hijab. And of course that's like really important, but there are so many other things that affect us too, and require attention and careful discussion. And so can we go beyond the hijab for once? And actually, even the conversation about the hijab is still very delimited, but yes. So in thinking about the language that frees us, I think it's important first to think about the language that constrains us, that limits us, that diminishes us, because that's what we are resisting against. And this diminishing, punishing, constraining language is very different in different contexts. It's different for different communities, and our task is always to be able to identify it, to recognize its patterns and contours. And in the context of Singapore, and especially pertaining to the Malay or Muslim community, these are some of its features. So first, we have the representative elites that will dominate the conversation, especially on issues relating to the community. And I think this phenomenon is also very much linked to our state's CMIO model, where racial communities are kind of kept in these limited boxes, and then they are assigned representatives, and then those representatives are assumed to be the voice of the community, when actually, of course, there are often much more diverse opinions within, every community, and it cannot be encapsulated or properly represented by someone, especially not by minority elites, and especially those who always come from one specific party or would have a specific kind of ideological and also class background. And sometimes people forget that a person may not always represent their racial communities' interests all the time. Sometimes they are representing their class interests. And if we look to the issue of the hijab, and for example, and then we have representative elites representing us for that too, right? And it's very strange because, for example, Minister Masagos, he has said before, the issues like the hijab, it has to be a closed door discussion. But who are sent to represent the community in these discussions? Well, they're usually, a lot of them, they tend to be men, or they tend to be like, I guess, like community leaders. But then what about like regular working class women who also want to wear the hijab and whose jobs are more, they're not really represented. We often talked about uniform services or nursing, but there's also other jobs where women want to wear the hijab, and maybe it's like more, it's more blue collar work. And actually those industries are also affected, but it's not usually represented. It's not going to be represented in these closed door discussions if the way that we are going to talk about issues relating to the community are going to be in this model of representative elites. Secondly, we have like Islamophobic and racist narratives being left unchecked and affecting the self-esteem of the community. And I think this results in a lot of shame in the community to confront issues that we need to confront, because we don't want to feel judged and feel like we are confirming the racist and Islamophobic ideas that people have about the community, right? And then, so I have like one of the headlines here. It was very notorious back then. It was the PAP youth member who posted a picture of a school bus, a madrasah school bus, and then said like, I don't know, something about like young terrorists, like these young terrorists, and then yeah, it became a big hoo-ha, and then he quit. And then later on, I think they posted like an article about how if he apologized to the community. Yeah, I don't forgive him, but okay. And then third is the upholding of the model minority. So, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of shame in the community because, you are receiving such demeaning narratives all the time. So what's a narrative that is preferred for a community that is constantly shamed? It will be elevating the cream of the crop. And of course, the ones that don't question things too much, too radically. And personally, to me, at heart, this is not only an elitist impulse, but it's also a very insecure impulse. And it's ultimately damaging because you don't have to be excellent to be a valuable person in the community, right? Ideally. And, value should never be assigned based on, who best climbs up the ranks. And what makes a community really move forward, to me, is not individual success, but acts of community engaging critically and working in issues in a very determined and honest way, and paying attention to our most vulnerable instead of shaming them or implying that they are holding the community back, holding everyone back because they are, and you get that. They won't say it outright, but there is the implication. So fourth, there is this like deliberate paradox that we often hear, which is that if you want to speak about any kind of discrimination you face, you will be kind of barraged with a lot of rational bros who will be like, well, actually it's fine. There's no like discrimination in Singapore, or like they'll treat each case in isolation and not as connected to a larger pattern. And they say you're overthinking, the country's systems are just, and systemic racism does not exist, which is something that we were told last year. Well, not systemic racism, but they use the word Chinese privilege does not exist, right? They'll say. And yet at the same time, minorities are also always figured as powerless and victims. But of what? If there is no discrimination, what exactly are you a victim of, right? So we are always told of our poor health, our overrepresentation amongst the poor. There was an article published late last year, by based on the words by Masagos, I think Minister Masagos, saying about like, people living in rental flat communities cannot get too comfortable living there. They need to aspire to live outside of rental communities, as if people really enjoy living in a rental community and being the subject of very shaming headlines. And so we're always told of these things, our overrepresentation amongst the poor in prison. So we are not figured as agents, not figured as empowered beings. And I think there's also this confusion where if we want to speak about what we are going through, any kind of like marginalized community, right? If you want to speak about what you're going through, not just the Malay Muslim community, any other, right? Then they'll say like, oh no, don't self-victimize yourself. You're not a victim. You shouldn't be victimizing yourself. But no, actually, when we speak up, we are taking agency. When we speak up about people and systems that fail us, that is an act of agency. And in actuality, what such people really want when they say that is that they want you to be real victims, which is that you do not speak up about the injustices you face. You will be very appeased and content with very staid and boring explanations that don't match up to the reality of what you might be facing, what your parents face, and what your grandparents face in much worse iterations. Or, it just, that's the reality. So let me see. Those are just some of the articles that I put up. So here I tell you, here's a good drinking game you can try, which is you can go Google after this. Just Google Malay community and progress and just see how many articles come up. It's just relentless. Every year for the National Day speech also, you can just, when it comes to the Malay community part, you can hear, oh, what is he going to say? When is the success bit going to come up? And so it's just this four are just a trickle of the deluge of the language we are faced with, that to me are an example of figuring the Malay community, for example, as deficient or backward. The trope of the lazy native is very much alive. So when you keep harping for decades condescendingly about how community is making progress, what are you implying, right? And so this is next. So I think about this quote by, now that I've set the scene somewhat on the language that diminishes us, and you have to understand that this is a language that has conditioned us, that has raised us. It shapes the way we think about ourselves and our community. How do we come up with a different way of speaking, thinking, and articulating? And I return to this wonderful quote by Bell Hooks, which points out the paradox I mentioned earlier about they don't want to accept that you have been victimized, but at the same time, they want to perpetually fix you as victim. And so the quote goes, all marginal groups who are victimized by institutionalized systems of dominations, race, class, gender, etc., are faced with the peculiar dilemma of developing strategies that draw attention to one's plight in such a way that will merit regard and consideration without re-inscribing the paradigm of victimization. This quote is from her book, Killing Rage. And of course, very imperative to understand she wrote this in the context of what African Americans were experiencing in the US. And but well, you know, she dedicates it to all marginal groups, right? Because it is a very common phenomenon. And what does this mean? It means that we need to be able to speak about what is unjust, what victimizes us and others in a way that does not diminish our agency, that does not forever locate us within our pain or our status as victims, and to speak of it in a way that reminds the listener that you are speaking your truth, like you are speaking your truth and your experience. And you are speaking this as a person participating in your own empowerment, and you're not simply a subject to be pitied, or you're not a project for someone else's savior fantasies. So how do we do this? We do this by allowing people to speak on their own terms. So I'm just sharing some of the pieces that have gone up on Beyond the Hijab. You can see with there's like intimate partner violence. This piece was about, I mean, the article, my mother was abused by my father, but everyone allowed it to happen. We published on disability in Islam. Rethinking disability in Islam is a really good piece. I really encourage you to read it. And I think one of the series that really taught me a lot was our South Asian series, addressing like South Asian Muslims in Singapore, because they're really a minority and a minority. A really interesting piece about why I believe prison abolition is a Muslim issue. So it touches on how incarceration in Singapore is actually very racialized, and the journey of a single unwed mother navigating asexuality as a Muslim woman. There's just quite a lot. I mean, I'm really proud of like the articles that we managed to put up, and you know, every single one is a very valuable story. And because they are able to share this with us, because we are allowing them to speak in their own terms. And there's really a lot more. So I really encourage you to read the pieces on our site. And actually we started Beyond the Hijab in 2013. Actually, I joined in 2017, but it started before that. And in 2014, back then, you know, during that period of time, it like sharing your story was enough to be considered groundbreaking, because there was such a poverty of narratives of marginalized communities. However, of course, by now we are seeing like this model of sharing personal narratives from marginalized identities and narratives. It can be co-opted, and it certainly has been. I mean, the recent issue with the Samsung ad, you see that you know, a queer person's narrative, you know, the narrative with their mom, it's a beautiful narrative, but kind of it was just dropped after a little bit of pressure from conservatives. And so I felt that, I mean, this is one example, but you know, throughout, ever since like 2014 until now, I always feel like the unearthing of trauma constantly by marginalized communities was something that was expected, but then it was not handled with care. So actually, raw representation is not enough. There's actually a lot of care that needs to go into respecting what a person has been able to do in order to share their story. Because a story is not just a story, right? It exists because time has been lived through. Their spirits may have been broken and regained. Trauma was experienced. And what I noticed is that like these stories will leave the heart of its owner, who might be telling it for the first time. And then it is being held for public consideration, you know, to be debated, to be dismissed, to be interrogated. And of course, there would be expressions of support as well, but there are also reactions of, there are always going to be reactions of those who are, I guess, they're unwilling to dismantle the status quo, or they are afraid to face up to their complicity in the violence that is being expressed the experiences that are being expressed by this person sharing their story. So thinking about all of these things and how the personal narrative has been kind of like elevated, especially if, okay, for example, Me Too. The Me Too movement was very much, it hinges on unearthing and sharing an extremely traumatic memory for everyone to see, but like at what cost, right? And so I don't think that a person's well-being and psychological safety should ever be sacrificed for the sake of a story. Like, people can learn in other ways. They don't need to learn at your expense. And so for me, in BDH, it's important that in sharing people's stories, that I also try to be responsible to them and mindful of their well-being. And I don't want the site and the community to be yet another place where people's stories and experiences are mined for profit or to look good, because you have to stand with the people who have trusted you with their vulnerability. So, and it is, every community is different, but it's very important to understand what kind of environment that this story is going to enter in. And so I'll just read a quote from one of the pieces that I wrote for, it's called Interrogating the Uncomfortable, and it was for the NUS Muslim Society. So it kind of talks about the complexities that speaking up has within the Muslim community. The public is more than happy when we speak about our happiness and our successes. State papers celebrate the model minority with perhaps the same intensity they regurgitate culturally essentialist reports on our rates of diabetes. They may even tolerate stories of grief, difficulty, and overcoming adversity if it lies within the comfortable limits of the apolitical and the personal. But when we speak of our deepest griefs and difficulties that we have yet to resolve or may never resolve, the ways in which our own community can be cruel or fail us, the ways in which our elites can be condescending to experiences they don't understand, such as poverty, the lack of institutional support, be it state or religious bodies, when faced with issues like domestic violence, these are things that can unearth hostile reactions from readers. So it's a delicate balance we have to hold, because minority communities are defensive communities a lot of times, and often for very valid reasons. So it is true within the context I'm speaking of that, the community experiences racism and Islamophobia in a post 9/11 world. But this doesn't mean that the person who speaks up is betraying their community, right? Or airing the dirty laundry. It means that they need support, and the community's responsibility is to care for them. To listen and to find that acknowledging and healing their pain is much more important than saving face, basically. But of course, like, it is quite, is a very delicate thing. For example, the issue of female genital cutting, FGC. I remember being in a focus group discussion, and I think it was at Yale NUS, and it was like it was about FGC lah. And it's very different. So you have, for example, Muslim women in that group, and they're saying, I have been cut, but I don't see it as such a big deal. And then you have non-Muslims who are like, oh, it's such a terrible thing. And then, they use the language of human rights, of course. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, and then, say, oh, it's terrible, it's horrible, you are defiling children, blah, blah, blah. And it makes the Muslim women feel very uncomfortable. But, this is something that has affected them directly. So are you going to say that they are wrong? And I think that's the thing with this kind of conversations. When I was there, I felt like I was saying, like, I couldn't say at that time because I was also kind of like figuring this out, but I understood at that. I understand now that actually the people best placed to talk about these things are always people within the community itself, because I can understand as a Muslim woman that it is very difficult to understand that something that was done to you like FGC was wrong, because it takes a personal journey to get there. It is very hard for you to be immediately have that kind of very strong reaction that the other non-Muslim people who have never experienced this can have, because they didn't grow up with, like, you know, some of the narratives that you did. And yeah, and I think it's very important to understand, because sometimes when people, I guess, they have good intentions and they want to speak about these things, but they're not aware of the nuances, the complexities, the narratives, the sensitivities within the community. They can end up actually alienating the community. They make the community feel alienated even more. Like, oh, this, you know, you feel like they're saying there's something wrong with you. How can you have such a backward practice? That's what they're feeling. Of course, that's not what you may intend, but I think that's why I think Beyond the Hijab and other community spaces are very important. And this is the same for like other communities, right? Like, yeah, I mean, someone who wants to talk about, for example, transphobia, of course, a trans person would be best placed to talk about it. And anyway, continuing. So I want to talk about now, since we kind of talked about what is the language that diminishes us, how do we hold this delicate balance, right? So here are just some of the considerations I have as an editor when fielding and publishing stories that people submit. So number one consideration for me is actually safety. Because like I mentioned earlier, you know, a lot of stories for the past like decade, you know, people kind of like share them, but then there's not much like aftercare, there's not much like sensitivity and thought put into like, is this the right way to do it, to just like dump it out and then let it be kind of like grilled by the public. You know, and oftentimes it's about a traumatic experience, right? So number one is like, does the person feel safe enough to share their story? Do they wish to put their name? So in Beyond the Hijab, we put pseudonyms. We allow for pseudonyms, and this is necessary for a lot of people, not just to feel a bit braver to tell their story, but also for safety. And for example, in our intimate partner violence series, every single person wrote with a pseudonym. They did not put their name to it, because sometimes they are still in that situation, or they have divorced their abusive partner, but they just don't want to be identified. And yeah, I think that's very important. So we allow for pseudonyms, and also, of course, ensuring that the person feels safe means also asking, do you really need to tell this story at this time? Yeah. And then, which is connected to the second thing, which is like, is the way the story told healing for them, or is it a reliving of trauma? So, you know, I don't, like I mentioned earlier, I don't think one story should come at the cost of a person's psychological safety and well-being. I think when you experience trauma and marginalization, there is a very strong desire at some point to share what happened to you, because you want affirmation that you went through this experience. But it doesn't necessarily mean sometimes that you're prepared for it, you know, because it's a different thing telling it to a friend and sharing it to the public. So I need to make sure I make this clear, because sometimes in Beyond the Hijab, some of the stories they are telling us is the first time that they are telling anyone. And, you know, do they want the first time to be to the public? You know, I don't want it to be a traumatic experience for them. So there have been some times when after a conversation, they're like, okay, maybe not now. Maybe I won't share this story right now. Maybe it's enough that, you know, that they just share it with me first. And then the next is like, are they prepared for the story to go public? And if there is sensitive information, do they think they can take the negative reaction it may receive? And this is really important. Like, to the best of my ability, if I see there is something that can have very strong reactions, I try to signal it to the writer first and ask them if they're okay to put it out. You know, not to censor, but out of concern that they understand how strong the reaction can be. And sometimes I also can't predict what can get very hostile reaction from the public. For example, there was like an article about madrasas from former students. So they were talking about how certain sexist ideas were taught to them, and inadequacy in terms of like syllabus and stuff like that. But they were also very mindful to point out that part of the reason why these problems existed was because there is a lack of resources being directed to madrasah. So they were very mindful of that, and they also talked about how the student community was very very good at supporting each other despite this lack of resources. But the reaction was very, very strong against these articles. Because I didn't anticipate it, in part because I wasn't part of the madrasah system, so I didn't know how close-knit they can be. It was kind of like circulating in WhatsApp, and I was very worried for the writers, but thankfully the women were okay, the ones who wrote it. Okay, so the second thing I look at is criticality. We don't want to just throw a story out there. I think that the story is not just something for a reader to consume. It is actually a journey for the writer to undertake when they write, especially something that is a personal story. And it's an opportunity to understand the experience that they're putting to paper, looking at it again. And it's important to look at how they are making sense of their story. Who do they identify as the main culprits, if they are, because you don't want to platform a piece that might be resorting to maybe xenophobic or a racist narrative, right? You want to kind of like help to guide, like to see, actually who is the one to blame. Are you sure it's this person? Are you sure this is the person who or is it this community that made things difficult for you? Are you sure? And I think, yeah, I mean, that's just, for me, it's really important to do. Also, how do they link their experience to others or to the community, if at all? And do they identify possible solutions, alternatives, and ways of being? Actually, I find this last part very inspiring, because actually you can learn so much if you're willing to listen to people on the margins, because who are best placed to suggest fixtures and things that need fixing, right, in the system, if not the people who have been failed by it. And when you look at, for example, the issue of domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, and all these things, when you look at how the queer community find chosen family, you see that, these are people who have managed to learn that there are other ways of creating care, creating community. There are other ways of practicing love than the ones that have been inherited and conditioned into us. And there are ways to kind of like support each other on very limited resources. And these are, I really wish that it was a much more common practice to really listen to what people have to say, those on the margins, because they actually they basically can point out the problems very clearly. Yeah. I mean, if you are a person who doesn't come from the community, didn't have a certain experience, you might have like an academic view of it. But then when you listen to someone directly, they can point out the issue in a much more visceral way. Anyways, so there are plenty of examples for that final point on how do they connect to a larger reason, right? But I will look at this particular excerpt from a piece about a person who experienced severe anxiety attacks due to religious trauma, her fear of the afterlife. So I'll just read this. I was fairly certain then that part of my anxiety came from my father. The religion he was taught instilled fear in the minds of everyone. In their minds, God was a punitive being. If you contract any sort of illness, it is God's way of telling you that you need to change your ways. If you miss one prayer session, you will be subjected to 1,000 years in hell. If you didn't contribute zakat, tax, you'd be resurrected on the day of judgment with your stomach full of snakes. My dad knew every punishment for every sin like the back of his hand. I realized how pervasive the problem was when I went to my grandma's tahlil, and the main prayer was something along the lines of, "Oh God, please do not let us die in an irreligious state. Oh God, please protect us from hellfire. Oh God, please free us from the punishments in the afterlife. These weren't the usual mindless recitations, as some people would tear up and wail when they said these things. They truly meant it. And then, so she talks a little bit more about what she went through, and then this was towards the end. Recently, I read an article about religious trauma syndrome, and I realized that it's aligned with my experiences. RTS is a result of experiencing an authoritarian mode of religion, one which instills fear to deter you from doing sinful things. You are always in danger of sinning in external punishment and eternal punishment. It has the ability to impair your cognitive ability by seeding self-doubt, and it even causes severe emotional distress for others. Sufferers of RTS are usually indoctrinated with these beliefs in childhood. And because the phobia indoctrination in childhood is so powerful, the fear of the afterlife may last a lifetime. So, I mean, this is an example of how they managed to connect their individual suffering to a kind of systemic explanation. Well, it's more scientific, I guess, but it recognizes that, okay, it's an authoritarian mode of religion that is kind of like, that has resulted in me experiencing this terrible thing, this anxiety attack. So I think when they're able to do this, it's ideal because we are about community building and understanding our experiences. And I think I try my best to guide the writers when needed. And actually a lot of people are able to do this by themselves, of course, to think about such things. Yeah. Where am I? Okay, so next would be inclusivity. I learned a lot about inclusivity actually and what can be done better over the years. And I learned a lot. Yeah. So, okay, anyway, the first one is who is excluded from this effort? How can they be included? Or is there a space they can be directed to? So, I mean, we are a platform to share stories, right? So one of the things is that you have to write it out. So actually, one of the things that feels very exclusionary for people is that those who feel anxious writing, or they feel like they're not good writers. So that's one thing. So how can they be included? Sometimes we would have to do up a workshop, or maybe someone can take the effort to interview a person so that the person doesn't have to write. So I mean, these are just like, there are ways to go around it. And how can they be included, or is there a space they can be directed to? So for example, I mean, in the past, we've platformed certain stories, and that was possible because we were smaller. But recently, because now we have more followers, and I think we've had a little bit more attention, I feel a bit afraid to platform certain stories because I don't want to expose people to harassment. And so what's possible is that maybe I can direct them to another space that will be a safer choice that can hold their story. So that's something to think about also. Next is, what do you need to change so more people can feel safer contributing? How can you apply and shift your methods from your failures? And if a story is not yours to tell, who can you seek? So every series there will be like an editor's letter. So I would usually be the one to write that, but certain things, certain topics, I don't feel equipped to write them, or I feel like someone else will have much better thing to say. So for example, the series that we had on divorce and single parenthood, I have neither been divorced nor am I a single parent. So I asked someone else who actually works with Daughters of Tomorrow, Subi, to write the editor's letter for us, and she wrote a fantastic letter. And yeah, I mean, that has been, and South Asian Muslim series as well, we had a guest editor too. Next is community. So you have to think about who is doing this work together with you. How can a story be located amongst existing narrative and communities? How can you stand in solidarity with other communities? And how can you build coalitions and links of support? So I'll go a bit more in detail in inclusivity. I actually learned a lot about it when we had like that workshop. We had a workshop for single and divorced mothers. So one thing is that we didn't do a call for submissions as we usually do. We actually decided, okay, let's make a writing workshop, because a lot of the women that we had in mind to contribute, they were not comfortable with writing. They've never like written out a piece really before. So it actually requires more work on your side, and you have to put it in order to, kind of like create that bridge, right? So one of the things I heard a lot was like, oh, I'm not a good writer. I don't know if my story is important. I don't have like a good story. But of course, that's not true, Every single person will have a important story to tell, because just by virtue of the fact that you are someone existing within this community, you are already the recipient of so many of these kind of like diminishing narratives. And how do you survive, in the face of that? There is a story in every person. So it was very interesting. I realized that just putting out a call for submissions is not enough, because it just means that the only people submitting are those who are able to kind of be comfortable with the written word. And actually, this issue of like literacy also, it kind of privileges the people who are very, very, very literate. And also, we had to ensure that we had child minding during the workshop, because like you're dealing with mothers, and mothers are so stretched for time. So we had to make sure that, there was someone to help take care of the kids, so that they can really be able to sit down and really kind of like think about their experiences and be able to write it. And I mean, we initially planned for 2, but we had 3 workshops in the end. And of course, there was like an attrition rate, so not everybody stayed till the end. But I think just to be able to sit there and talk to each other, like, the mothers to be able to bond with each other, because they have a lot of shared experiences, was very, very touching to see. And another thing for me was like, I learned not to be too heavy-handed with the editing, because I realized like sometimes the way, especially when you're talking about some people who are talking about a traumatic experience, the way that they write their narrative might be different. They might not be able to shape it in a very linear fashion, because sometimes the way they make sense of it is different. There was one piece, for example, she could not write it in the first person. She could only write about it through the third person. And I didn't request for change, because I could recognize it was her way of distancing herself from that story. It was the only way that she was able to write about it. And then there was another piece where, as the woman wrote, she wrote down, oh no, I'm feeling triggered. And I think it was just like a side thing, but I decided to just keep it in the piece, just to show that, I think for me, it's a very honest thing to write down. And also it's a very honest portrayal of like how much is being, the amount of vulnerability that it took for these women to write down their story. And I think it was a very important and enjoyable session for all of us. Like the ladies really appreciated the workshops, and there was also like there was a sense of pride in being able to write down their story. Okay, I'm told I have 10 more minutes. Okay. Yeah. So, and it was also a way for me to learn, how do you help people be present and be able to participate. This is very important. Okay. Next is community, right? So Beyond the Hijab, we don't really see ourselves as an isolated group. Community is important, and we see our work as connected to the work of our community groups. So the ones that we are closest to, for example, is like Penawa and Creed Talk, and we are friends and we work together when we can. So for example, we put out joint statements together regarding the Okay Let's Go issue and the digital sexual harassment that Ustazahs faced last year. And of course, we try to maintain connection with other groups as well, even if we don't share the same content. But if we have the same goals of social justice and someone cutting grass, I hope it's not too noisy, and making safe spaces, then we see that as very important coalition building work. And In Singapore, I think like people often delimit what you should only care about. You should only care about your community's concerns. Only talk about Malay and Muslim issues if you're Malay and Muslim. And but we believe we should stand in solidarity with other communities, because this CMIO kind of model where each racial and religious community is separate, except when it comes to identifying yourselves as Singaporean. It's very isolating, and it doesn't help communities understand each other at all. So that's why I think there are so many gaps, so many misunderstandings and lack of understanding of each other's culture, right? And then because we're just only asked to tolerate each other, not actually really understand each other. So even if we aim to platform stories by Muslim women, we also believe that it's important to acknowledge that our lives as Muslim women is not just about our religion, not just about our race, but also our experience of mental health, gender violence, intra-community conflict, homophobia, fatphobia, so many other things. And so I think coalition building is really important. And so this quote by Audre Lorde kind of says it: coalition building is not easy. You don't make coalition because you like those in the coalition. You make coalition because none of us are going to triumph alone. And I think, in the past few years, it's great to see how different community groups in Singapore have been supporting each other to ask for a host of things. It's not just like the Muslim community groups in Singapore and how we advocated for things like allowing the hijab in the workplace or speaking up against misogyny, but we have queer groups who are advocating for their own rights against 377A, and we have like climate activists who they managed to throw a whole rally and talk about how perhaps like certain universities are complicit with the fossil fuel industry, and I think that's really important. Oh, where am I? Okay, so I end with this quote by Nawal El-Saadawi: "I speak the truth, and the truth is savage and dangerous." In thinking about what is the language that frees us, I guess it sounds very technical, but in sum, I would say it is the language that frees us is one that knows what needs to be resisted. It is one that cares for the listener as well as the storyteller. It is gentle but also dangerous. It is capable of building strong bridges, but also capable of destroying those that deserve to be destroyed. Bridges, not people. The language that frees us is the same language that frees our family and our friends, and frees those across the border if need be. It builds links with everyone who has the same anxieties and experiences as us. Is the language of autonomy and of love, and it is a language that we create together and that we evolve and develop together.